Hey there, makers. Thanks everybody for joining. Happy Wednesday. Thanks for being here. My brain stopped working for a second. I am really excited because I'm Sarah, by the way. If you are just tuning in for the first time, say hello. We are talking this week about some kind of back to basics information about yarn. It's kind of a yarn 101, but I think this is helpful if you have experience. Stick around. You can help me give tips, but maybe you'll learn something also. I think that you will. And it's always a good refresher if you, um, you know, have been knitting or crocheting for a little while and we can learn together. I'm rambling, guys. Hi, guys. Hi, Mary. Hi, Lori. Hi, Chris. Hi, Andrea. Thank you for joining, of course. So we have so much to go over, and I think just enough time to do it, but we'll see. We are going to be doing a little lesson on how to read a yarn label. We're going to talk about yarn weights and what the heck do they mean. We're going to talk about gauge. What is gauge? How do you check your gauge? And we are going to be talking about dye lots as well, because they are very important. And I have heard that a lot of people have had questions about dye lots recently. So I was like, the people need me. I'm just kidding. Already getting questions on the sweater. This is the Coastal Grandmother sweater, which was part of our Coastal Grandma collection. It's made with 24/7 cotton, and it's really cozy, and I love it. How cute is that? Free pattern on our website. Coastal Grandmother. So cute. Laura, you ignore dye lots. You're very brave. Okay. We can jump right in. We can start talking about the yarn labels. What do you guys think? I have Pound of Love, trusty Pound of Love. If you were here last week, you already know that Pound of Love is the featured yarn for March. If you want to learn more about it, go to lionbrand.com, and it's like right there at the top. You can't miss it. You can see all the information about it and different patterns that you can make with it. You know the drill. So we can start there. Let me pull over my camera. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to switch between yarns throughout, so stick with me. Just kidding. This is Pound of Love, obviously. And this is really like where the most info is. I'm showing you Pound of Love because not only is it our featured March yarn, the label's nice and big so we can see all the symbols together. But before we get to that, I want to show you this little bit right here. This is a really like Lion Brand thing. The other stuff I'm going to talk about is pretty standard throughout most yarns. But this is just a little guide that we put on the yarns to tell you how many balls of yarn you need for what project. Does that make sense? I feel like I didn't say that. So here you can see, I hope you can see, if you want to make a scarf with Hometown, you're going to need 4 balls. If you want to make a sweater, you're going to need 10. This is just like a nice little reference when you're like in the craft aisle and you see that color that you love and you're like, oh, I really want that, but how much should I buy? You just look right here and it'll tell you. So that's really handy. That's a Lion Brand thing. But this stuff is on pretty much every ball of yarn that you are going to see, especially in the craft store. So let's talk about it. We can start with the pretty straightforward stuff. Also, guys, feel free to drop questions in the comments, and I will try and stop and answer them every once in a while. So here we go. The like easiest information that you will want to know is starting up here. This is how much yarn is in each ball. So this is the yardage, 1,020 yards, 932 meters. We also have how much it weighs. This is pound of love, so it weighs 16 ounces. This is going to be on all of the yarns. Very helpful when you have different patterns and you need to know how many yards. Let's see. Crochet uses more yarn than knit. Which one does this label is just for the yarn. Doesn't matter what craft you're doing with it. I'll get into the gauge and the hooks and stuff. But yeah. And is there a track to get the center post started on Pound of Love? No, I'm sorry. You have to just put your faith in your fingers when you're pulling from the center pole here. Here we go. Okay. We also have the fiber right here. This yarn is 100% premium acrylic. So that's easy enough. It's going to have all of the fibers that are in here. Next, oh, I see what you're saying. If you say a hat takes 1 skein, is that knitting or crocheting? We try to put this for both crafts. You were referring to these guides. This is for both crafts. So it's an estimate, it depends on your pattern, etc. So there you go. That was a great question, actually. Okay, next up we have the care instructions. So this is machine washable and dryable. We also include these little symbols here. I don't know what they mean, but maybe you do. You can look them up on the internet. But we wrote it here in plain English for people like me who don't know what the symbols mean. We also have the country of origin on all of our yarns. So that is that. Now, this section is like a little bit more technical. I'm going to start with the weight. So all of our yarns list the yarn weight with this little symbol, this yarn ball with the number on it. This is the standard from the Craft Yarn Council. You might see it like just written out, like it says medium here. You might just see that. There's also some different terms for all of the weights. Now, when I say weight, I know that that's confusing because, oh, Sarah, you just said the weight right here, it's 16 ounces. When we say the weight of the yarn, and this is just a standard like yarn industry term, it means the thickness of the yarn. I know that that's confusing. And if I made it up, I would have changed it, but I didn't. So if you want to know what the thickness of the yarn is, we call that the weight. You're going to check this number here. I also have this handy little chart here. Let me pull it up for you. So these are all of the weights that are recognized by the Craft Yarn Council. It goes from 1 to 7. So 4 is medium. It's right in the middle. This is really handy for you to know. I'm sure most of you know this, but just going over it with the weights. Something to note is that these weights sometimes have different names. Like, for example, you might hear medium weight referred to as worsted weight. You might hear bulky weight referred to as chunky weight. Some of these have different names. So if you want to see a full list, you could check out the standards list on the Craft Yarn Council website. Just a little pro tip there. Did we get any questions? You can find the chart on the Craft Yarn Council. They have like a very detailed chart. We have some charts on our website as well, so you can check them out. You can also filter our yarns when you're shopping, like all of our yarns on lionbrand.com. You can filter by weight. So if you have a pattern that calls for a sport weight yarn, for example, you can see all of Lion Brand sport weight yarns. So that is very handy. All right, the next bit we're going to talk about right here is the gauge for the yarn and the needles and hooks. That's what these two little squares mean. And I'm going to admit to you, I did not know what these meant for the longest time. And maybe you don't know either. Oh, Elaine, that's a great point. In different countries, we refer to the yarns by completely different names. The weights, rather. Like you mentioned, 10 ply is worsted. Yeah, so it depends on where you live as well. Thank you, Nikki. Here's the link for the weight system. Thanks, Nikki. That would have been helpful if I gave you that. So there you go. Okay. So this part talks about the gauge of the yarn. Starting at the top, we have the recommended needle size, see knitting needles, and here the recommended hook size. So it's an 8 or a J10. And that's just good to know if you just want to like pick up the ball, you're in the craft store and you're like, what needles? Like if I just want to make a scarf, what needles should I use? This is a great place to start. Or anything similar, like you can go up or down a size and it'll probably work out just as well. And that just means that the tension of your project is going to be like just right. It's not going to be too tight. Your stitches aren't going to be like tight. They're not going to be like loose and have holes in them. It's like Goldilocks. So these numbers around the sides of the square, the bottom and the side, refer to the gauge that you get when you knit or crochet with this size that equals to 4 inches. So I'm going to talk more about gauge in a minute, but I do have some swatches here. So for example, and I don't think you can read this on here, so you're just going to have to take my word for it. This hometown is 6.6 stitches wide and 8 rows vertically. And that will make a square that is 4 by 4. So that is what that's telling you. That's what those numbers mean. This is handy for different things like comparing, like if you're substituting a pattern, you just want to know, it really tells you like just, sorry, there's also like a drain going on in this room. I'm not flushing the toilet. It really tells you like how many stitches you're getting per inch, and that tells you how chunky your project is going to be. Obviously, you can tell just by looking, but this is telling you in a little bit more technically, and I'm going to talk about gauge. We're going to talk about gauge very soon, but we're still talking about the yarn label. So that is some handy information. The recommended hook and needle size, I feel like people are always asking me, especially like when you're just in the store and you see it and you're like, oh God, that yarn's so beautiful. This is a good way to get started. You could pick up the yarn and just grab these needles or this hook. Okay, so that's like the bulk of how to read the yarn label. Nikki's also throwing in a really quick TikTok video that I did about how to read the label, which has the same information, but if you don't want to rewatch this because it's kind of long, you can head over there. But you also are going to want to look at this information around the barcode. Yes, this live will be available. Same with all of our lives. They're available afterwards. So if you tuned in late, don't worry, you didn't miss anything. You can go back. Well, I mean, you did, but but you can go back and start it from the beginning. Once this is over, it will be available. Okay, so this is the color information for this individual ball of yarn. So like all of the Pound of Love labels are going to have this, but this is going to be different for them. This is the color. This is the color number. That's just a little reference that maybe is number 109. You don't need to know that, but it's on there. But what you do need to know is this special number here, which is the die lot. I already saw some of you were saying that you ignore the die lots. And some of you are saying don't do that. So I have a feeling that most of you know why they're so important. But I did hear that people were having questions about dye lots, so let's talk about it. The dye lot is specific to a batch of yarn, and that's how it works. I recently got to see how this was done, so I'm very excited about it. These yarns get put into like a big tub together with the dye, and there's a recipe for the dye, what pigments go into the dye, and it's the same recipe that's used every time. Now, there's some factors that might change how the dye looks on the yarn. So the lot is like each batch that goes into this big tub together is a dye lot. If you use yarns from two different dye lots, there's a chance that they might not match perfectly. And that is because of a lot of different reasons. It could be, the material in the yarn might have changed subtly. They might have left it in the bath a little too long compared to like one day to the next. Some of these yarns that we've had for a long time, they probably have the same color recipe, but maybe it's made in a new factory now. So it might have changed. There's a lot of reasons, but you might notice when you make something and you have these two colors that are like, they're the same color, they're both navy, but they're two different dye lots. You might be able to see that like subtle, like sometimes it's just a shade. Sometimes you can see it and you're like, whoa, but sometimes it's like a very, very subtle difference. And when you work it all up, you can see that difference. And I don't want to say it's going to ruin your project, but it depends on how much of a perfectionist you are, if that is going to bother you. So that's why it's really important. If you're making a project and it comes with, if it requires more than one ball of yarn, you got to check that dye lot. It's right here. It's usually, oh, you can't see it there. That's great. It's usually stamped on, like these are printed on, but this is stamped on because this is different. So that's what you should look for. Don't just look at the color number. That's all well and good, but you want to match these dye lots. That's my dye lot soapbox. Yes, and Chris, that's a great point. That even a white cannot match because, they're not always just like natural. The yarn itself can have a pigment to it. So it can work. Now, here's the thing. If you don't, okay, first of all, one disclaimer, we can't guarantee when you're buying from our website that your dye lots are going to match. And if you like have a yarn that you bought, and you want to buy some more, we can't like help you find a yarn that is the same dye lot. Like, I wish we could, but that would take a lot of effort and time from us. So that's my disclaimer. Now, if you don't have a matching dye lot, like that it's not the same, there's two things you could do. First thing is, I guess if you want to find a matching dye lot, you can go on Ravelry, look up the yarn, and see if anybody has it up for sale or trade. And usually they list the dye lots there. You might get lucky. I don't know. And people are very helpful. Reach out on social media to other knitters and crocheters. I've sold yarns that I wasn't going to use to people who were looking for that dye lot. Second thing you can do is take a swatch or just like a strand of yarn to the craft store with you and just like hold it up. Personally, I would take it to like the front of the store and go to the window so you can see it in daylight and see if they're matchy enough. Again, it's going to be subtle, but sometimes you can eyeball it. So that's my advice on dye lots. They're important. Am I preaching to the choir here? Do you guys know about dye lots and you are like, shut up, talk about something else? Fine, I will. I'm just kidding. we are going to talk next about gauge, and then I'm going to tell you about the sale, which is like really good today. I have some tips on gauge if you are like somebody who checks their gauge. So yeah, I just want to read through some questions and have a sip of water. This is like a real lesson. How am I doing, by the way, with the lesson? Are you guys learning? I've never done a lesson like this before. But I get to put all of this like yarn nerd knowledge that I've gathered over the year to use today. Okay. Yes, it will really show if you have a solid piece and you have two different dye lots. Always bring a strand because you learned the hard way. I'm sorry, that sounds that sounds sad. Let's see. Great information. Great. Okay. I'm glad to hear it. Oh yes, this is a great tip. You can alternate every other row if you have two different dye lots. That's like a real pro tip. So thank you, Janice, for bringing that up. If you have two different dye lots, you can alternate every other row and it might blend that color difference a little bit. You try it. Desperate times call for sometimes it's annoying, you don't want to. But trust me, I've had situations where I didn't really think about it. And dye lots go for, hand dyed yarns to yarns that you're buying in the craft store. They all have dye lots. There's like only a couple yarns that I know of that don't have dye lots. So it's really important. And I've had this happen where like I've used the yarn and there's like a line right through the back of your sweater. I wear it anyway, but just one of those things. Okay, let's talk about gauge. As we're winding down, I'll try to get through this part somewhat quickly. And this is, I also want to disclaim, this is like a quick and dirty gauge lesson right here. I'm going to share some tips on pro tips, but there's like a lot more to learn about gauge. So I hope this is what I really want to reinforce to you today is that you need to check your gauge. Here, hold on. I'm gonna do this. Check your gauge. If you are making something that needs to fit a person, a sweater, a hat sometimes, any kind of top, like I'm not talking about like a scarf. Like toys are probably fine. Home decor is probably fine if you don't feel like it. But like if there's so many times that people come in to have said to me, oh, I knit a sweater, but it came out way too big or it came out way too small. And they're like, I promise I followed the pattern. I'm sure that you did. But if you didn't check your gauge, then like you're doomed from the start. That sounds very dramatic, but that is that's how it goes. So your gauge is super important. So I really want you guys to just, if we take away any lesson from this, it's important. Here's why it's important. I like to think of knitting patterns like a recipe. You get the ingredients, which are, the yarn and the needles and the hooks, and you get the steps. And, you've all done it. We cooked from a recipe. We followed it all the way, but like something was off. And the gauge is like one more step to make sure that something was off. It's kind of like calibrating your oven to make sure that it's like the same exact temperature that the recipe calls for. Or, if you are using like a really vague recipe that's like put butter in the pan, like this is like saying a tablespoon equals like how many grams you should be using. So the gauge swatch is really going to tell you, it's going to really calibrate your stitches to the pattern. And just keep in mind that whoever wrote the pattern, they're also using like their own personal tension. We all have different tension. Some people knit really tight. Some people knit and crochet. Sorry, when I say knit, I'm feeling I'm going to say knit a lot, but I mean knit and crochet, same situation here. Some people are tight, some people are loose. Sometimes you have a bad day and you're like taking out your anger on your stitching and it comes out really tight. Sometimes you're like chill, you're having a glass of wine and your stitches get looser. So like it's really personal. There's no like your gauge is like wrong. It just might not match. And so it's really important that you check that your gauge is matching as close as possible to the pattern, or else you're either going to run out of yarn, which thank you, Elaine, for bringing that up, or your project isn't going to fit. And it's so much work. Everyone hates making gauge swatches because you get your yarn, you're so excited to start, right? And then you have to do this like one extra step and it's like boring and it's tedious and you might have to do it over again. But if you don't get your gauge right, then the rest of your project might just be like an entire waste of your time. I know, so you should check your gauge. Wine affects my stitches too, Jane. So let's look at some swatches. I realized that this knit swatch is not perfect, and I'm going to tell you why. But let's pretend I used the gauge off of this ball for these two swatches. So we'll pretend that you have a pattern that calls for this gauge. So for example, the crochet gauge, I'm sorry if you can't see this, I know it's really small, is 6.6 stitches by 8 rows. That is 4 by 4 inches. So if your pattern called for that, I did 7 stitches because 6.6 is a silly number and doesn't have to be like exactly like bang on completely the same, because the lovely thing about knitting, especially with acrylic or wool, is that you have some stretch there. So like if you're a little tiny bit off, it's okay. But if you're off by like, I don't know, half an inch or more, like you're going to have fit issues. So I'm going to knit across these stitches. Knit, oh my God, this is crochet. Also, this is measuring. I'm going to measure across, I'm losing it, guys. Okay. I'm going to measure across the swatch that I made. And you can see that it is just about 4 inches. So I would be very happy with that. And I will also do the same vertically. And it's yeah, I would accept this. So in this case, you know, keep doing what you're doing. That is what I would say. Now, in both of these cases, but I'm going to show you the knit swatch because it really shows some of the issues here. You should not do what I did, which was just I cast on what the gauge I was looking for. And the gauge here is 9 stitches by 12 rows. So I just cast on 9 stitches here. What I would suggest that you do is at least add 2 more stitches, like 1 on either side, because check this out. My last stitch on the row, especially for knitting, for crochet, you could probably get away with it. My last stitch is curling under. This is like almost always going to happen. You can also do a couple of rows of garter stitch or like a couple stitches of garter stitch to make sure everything lays flat. But I was just showing a quick version. So as you can see, this is not measuring to 4 inches. Maybe it would if we had those 2 extra stitches on the side that weren't curling. But for the purposes of this exercise, because I just showed you, oh, that's how you measure the gauge. This one's perfect, great. But what if it's not perfect? Because most of the time it's not. And for me too, you know, I'm an experienced knitter and crocheter. My gauges, sometimes I have to do my gauge swatches like 4 times. And then I have to, you know, just pray and make a leap of faith when it comes to the needle size that I choose. So if your swatch is not measuring up, and in this case, we're short, we're about half an inch short of 4 inches, I would, you need to go up a needle size. If your swatch is too big, you need to go down a needle size because you want your stitches to be smaller. And that will tell you how, that will tell you like that your tension, you want your tension to be the same. It doesn't matter if the needle size that the pattern calls for is different as long as your gauge matches. You could start with the size that it calls for, but you know, try it out. So you might have to make a couple gauge swatches with different size needles and hooks. And that's why we all hate doing it. And yes, Donna, totally, the last 2 stitches on each side should not be included in the measurements. Like I said, don't make a swatch like I did. Make a bigger one. And this is, again, it's like we hate doing it, so we make it like the smallest. So I used to make a tiny swatch, and then I would divide the number of stitches by 4 because it's, you know, a 4 by 4 square. And I'd be like, okay, 1 inch of stitches equals like 2 stitches, and then I would just measure like 1 inch because I wanted to get going so much. So it's important that you do it that way. Okay. 2 excellent questions from you guys that I really like. I wanted to address this. So thank you for asking. Susanna, do you recommend, I think you mean washing and drying. And yes. And here's what I'm saying, like I get in the weeds with the gauge swatches, and it's to your benefit. It's going to take time, but you know, you should do whatever you're going to do to your finished project to your gauge swatch. So if you're going to block it, block the swatch. If you're going to put it in the washing machine, wash the swatch. I know it sounds like overkill, but you know, if you make it and then you put it in the washing machine, and I'm not with, most of our yarns are machine washable and dryable, but if you make something and then it shrinks a little bit or it grows because it's wet, you want to make sure that your swatch, you're treating it the same exact way. So that's a great question. Again, that is why it's tedious, because I do like to block my swatches. So then I gotta wait like a whole other day before I can start the project while I'm waiting for my swatch to dry. So that is a great question. And then Jennifer, to measure the gauge, do you need to do a specific stitch? Amazing question. Yes, yes, yes. You do whatever stitch the pattern calls for, because like if it's, you know, if it's double crochet and you do a swatch and single crochet, like that doesn't really mean anything. That's not really telling you useful information. So the pattern will tell you, if it's a good pattern, it'll tell you what stitch your swatch should be made in. You want to do this, again, whatever you want it to be, as close to your actual finished project that you want it to be. So yeah, make sure that you use a specific stitch. And here's some more overkill. If it's done in the round, you want to work your swatch in the round as well. When I'm knitting versus purling, your tension can be different with your purl stitches than it can with your knit stitches. So your gauge might be off when you are working in the round because you're only doing knit stitches. Again, we're getting in the weeds, but I love it. And I'm glad that you guys are asking these questions. Totally. I'm going to take a couple more questions, and then I've already run out of time, but we're gotten in there. Does blocking matter with acrylic? That's a personal question, whether you want to block your acrylic pieces. And I'd love to find, I don't want to just give you an answer on how to block acrylic. I think like a gentle steam blocking is the best way to block acrylic, but let me get back to you guys. Maybe we should we'll do another episode with like 102 on blocking and stuff like that, because I do see some questions on blocking. And it's different for every fiber, like you're asking. How do you measure in the round? You can measure the same way. What I do, and I don't have my like round needle, so this might not make sense, but I make like a flat swatch, and then once I knit it, I just like pull it all the way back around to the beginning, and I just kind of like pull the yarn loosely around. So you get like this big like barf on the back of yarn. So it kind of looks like that with every row. But then you don't have to like actually like knit it in the round. Like you're still technically like knitting every row, but it's not like a round piece. The back is flat. If we do a 102, I'll bring you one of those. And then when you measure it, you can either like cut those tails and like lay it flat, or I just lay it flat because again, I am like, I just want you guys to know that I know how to do it the right way, but I'm still lazy and I just want to get it done. So let's definitely talk more about blocking and swatching. I'm really excited that you guys are so into it, and I hope that you learned some stuff. And I also thank you to everybody who's experienced and can just, you know, back me up on how important things like dye lots and gauge swatches are, because we're human. We don't always, we like to cut corners, but you know, it takes all of us saying, no, make sure that you check your gauge swatch. And when you're checking out your yarn, make sure you check that the dye lots are the same. Yeah, so thank you guys for that. Oh, I almost forgot. We have a great deal today. If you go to lionbrand.com, we have some new colors that were added to our clearance yarns, and they are up to 60% off today. And I was, hold on, oh, something fell. It's okay. Let me find the price on this because I was so impressed. This Pound of Love in this color navy that I was showing you guys right now is on sale for $6.99. It's normally $13.99. So this is until tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Eastern time. So there's a lot of other good stuff in there too. So I highly recommend you check out the clearance yarns today, and make sure that you tune back in. We'll do another little 101 info class. Tune in next week, same time, same place. We're going to be talking about some yarn, our old favorite, of course. And if you missed any of this and you want to go back and make sure you didn't miss it, you can, this will be on our page, wherever you're watching it now, on Facebook or on YouTube. And you can watch it from the beginning, and, you know, shoot us any other questions, and maybe we can incorporate that into, oh my gosh, my hair looks crazy. Maybe we can incorporate that into another live, because I would love to kind of answer more questions for you and spread some knowledge. I love it. Yeah, thanks guys for tuning in, and until next week, happy stitching. Bye guys.